what we have are these two torus knots, and I have just an animated camera. In my scene, there's actually nothing animated as far as no moving objects, no moving characters, nothing. Everything is static except the camera. Now, this is a perfect scenario for completely eliminating Final Gather. So let's come in and just start with our basic render settings. If I were to take a quick render at what we have currently, you can see at this point really we have no Final Gather enabled here at all. So let's come into my indirect lighting, enable Final Gather. Okay, there's my Final Gather result. Now in this particular scene, I have the illumination sort of coming from these little luminance planes. So these are just simple polygon planes with a surface material that's been applied to those. These can be used really easily as sort of a large area light. I've also used these because these types of a light setup, if you're using just these luminance planes to light your scene, this is really prone to flickering. So I've done this as a way of definitely illustrating some ways in which you can get some really strong flickering, and hopefully some pretty surefire ways of eliminating those in your scene. So this should be a really great scenario for getting some really bad flickering, for lack of a better word. So knowing this, that I only have these two luminance planes in here, and I don't want any extra light coming from my default scene light, I'll go back to my Common tab, into the render options, and disable the default light. Okay, let's come back in here, and in my case I do have a specific render camera set up, so make sure that I render from that. Okay, there we go. So there's our luminance planes that are providing just strictly Final Gather illumination in here. Now, if we wanted to, we could come in and just test this out. Maybe just a quick max sample level. And just for the sake of demonstration, we can come in here and maybe just do a quick render test, just to really see if we do have some flickering that needs to be fixed up. So we'll call this something like lesson 3, and we'll set this to name number extension, and I'll just maybe render out a simple 24 frames. I'll do a quick batch render of this just so you can see what we have. Okay, so once this renders out, if I open this sequence up in something like fcheck, you can definitely see some flickering, especially around these shadows. So lots of flickering, lots of jittering in the shadows, quite a bit of blotchiness that's also happening back here as well. So there's a number of things that we could do to smooth this out, and we'll talk about these as we start to get into some of our later lessons. But what I want to do is show you a scenario where if you have, let's say, everything in your scene that's completely still and static, but the only thing that's moving is your camera, what we could actually do is bake down the Final Gather result so that it's not actually being calculated on every single frame. So to do this, let's go to our Indirect Lighting tab, let's go down to Final Gathering, and let's first go down to the Final Gathering map rollout. Let's start by enabling this map visualizer. Now once we do that, it will go ahead and start to basically write out our Final Gather information into a map. So from this camera, if I come in and just do a quick render, so we'll let that finish out, there we go. Now if I close this, we can actually see those Final Gather points here in my viewport. So this is what I was talking about in our first lesson, whenever we were talking about these Final Gather points that are casting out these rays. This is basically those Final Gather points. Now these Final Gather points exist basically because they've been cast out from this camera. Now if I switch to another camera like my perspective view, you can see where that camera that I was using right here, you can see right where it wasn't able to see behind these original objects, so we don't get these Final Gather points in these areas. Now that's all well and good, but what happens if we, let's say, maybe just bake down this Final Gather data to where we only use these points? Well, what we could do is right now this rebuild option is set to on. So what that means is that every single frame, the final gather result gets recalculated. Now what we could do is set this to an option like freeze. Now what that means is that Maya will now only read the final gather data that was written into this map. So essentially, it's only going to use the points that we see here. Well, that's still not really a great solution because the final gather result looks great from this frame, but as soon as my render camera starts to swing over, we're going to be able to see these really odd looking areas that were not initially seen whenever we cast these final gather points out. So here's how we can start to work around this. Instead of using this freeze option, what we can do is set it to rebuild off. Now, this is sort of a unique setting because with this rebuild set to off, what that's going to do is now take any new final gather points that we're missing the next time we render, and it will write these missing areas into our existing final gather map. So, if I come in, do another quick render, and give this just a second, watch my viewport back here in the background. As soon as the render completes, now we see all these new final gather points pop up that were cast from this camera angle. But it did not get rid of the existing final gather points that I had previously. It's just taken these two final gather results and merged those together. So what we can do is maybe just go from a few different angles here. And again, with this rebuild option still set to off, we can just basically continue to write data into that final gather map. So if you take a look at the project that we have created here, this is our default project that's created as part of your download. So once you download the project files and open this up, if we take a look inside the render data, inside Mental Ray, there's the final gather map. So this is the map that we are currently creating. So you can see right now it's a little over 2 megabytes in size. So this is the final gather map that's being written into. And at the moment, every time we hit the render button, it's going to continue to add more data into this map. So if you keep in mind this number, 2.7 megabytes. Now if I come in and render this again, from this new camera angle, again, if you watch here in my background, you should see these new final gather points pop up. So now, in addition to all of the existing final gather information, this new angle has been written in as well. And if you take a look at my final gather map, you can see that new data is reflected in the file size. So we can come in here and continue to add more data for any missing angles. It looks like, though, for the most part, we've got a pretty good coverage here. Maybe a little bit of a sparse area from one of these angles. So maybe just come in and render one more time to fill that in. There we go, much better. And what you'll notice is that every time we render and add new data into this existing map, our renders times start to get a little bit smaller because there's less and less data to have to write in here because there should be fewer and fewer blank spots to have to fill in. Okay, so once we have this data that is basically baked down from all angles, now we can set our rebuild option to freeze. Now with the rebuild set to freeze, Maya is no longer going to recalculate the final gather result. It's now going to read these points strictly from the existing file. So now what we should see is with this rebuild set to freeze and all the information written into this map, the next time we hit render, you can see it doesn't even go through the final gather point calculation. The points are already there. It just jumps right to the final render. Okay, so now if we were to come in and batch render this result, once that render is complete, once again, I could just open up that sequence in Fcheck, and if I take a look at this, you can see that there is absolutely no flickering whatsoever happening in this particular render. Now, in my previous lesson, I had mentioned that technically the flickering is always there because the points are always being recalculated every frame. Now, this is probably the one scenario where that's not true because in this case, the points are not being recalculated every frame. It's strictly reading from this existing map, which means there is no flickering to be seen here. Now, again, this is a pretty limited scenario because we can only use this type of a solution if we have no moving objects in the scene. So, if I were to take an object and, let's say, move it, you can see the final gather information still stays put. It really isn't moving anywhere. So if I had any sort of an animated character or an animated object that needs to now move, the next time I render this out, if I save that image for comparison and re-render, you can see the final gather result completely breaks because it's still using that existing stored data, which does not move with the object itself. Okay, so again, this is a fairly limited scenario, but if you have any sort of just a animated camera, some sort of a camera fly-through of an architectural scene, or maybe if you're doing just a simple camera turntable on a character where the character doesn't have to move itself, this can be a perfect scenario for getting completely flicker-free final gather results. Now, in our next lesson, we'll start to break down some slightly more complex scenarios and start to see where we can begin reducing the amount of final gather flickering in some sort of an animated scene.